It is now commonplace to say that the roller course of the 16th century Europe can be regarded as larger stages on which the drama of royal authority was played out. This is particularly true for the court of the Valois monarchy in France. Since Louis XI's triumph over the nobles at the conclusion of the War of the Public Weal in 1465, the crown and supporters aimed to harness and control the apparatus of image-making in order to solidify the permanent boundaries between the conflicting and overlapping jurisdictions of France's political and social institutions. In this regard, the reigns of Francis I and Henry II saw successful efforts in harnessing and controlling this apparatus as an army of artists, historians, poets, clerics, all produced a flood of visual and print and material media to project an image of a stable monarchy whose rule was legitimate. As we see in Francis I's depiction as an amalgamation of the A-list of the Greek pantheon, or in the Arch of Henry II, which during his royal entry into Paris on June 16, 1549, depicted the king as the Hercule Galois, or the Gallic Hercules. However, by the late 1560s, the crown lost control of the apparatus of image-making, as both Protestant and radical Catholic factions undermined the legitimacy of Charles IX and Henry III during the wars of religion. In this conflict over the legitimacy of the crown, history became a weapon of incredible propagandist value, as supporters and detractors of the Valois monarchy poured over medieval histories to either defend or delegitimize its right to the throne. This paper proposes to examine what I consider to be our two representative examples of how histories were used to reimagine the French monarchy in the last half of the 16th century. The first is Pierre Ronsard's romance, The Francide, which was published to coincide with Charles IX and Elizabeth of Austria's entry into Paris in 1571. The second example is Francois Hopkins' Franco Gallia, written a few years after the 1571 entry. It was a response to the slaughter of nearly 3,000 Protestants in Paris during the St. Bartholomew Massacre of August of 1572. The first four books of the Francide were published in 1571. Commissioned by Henry II, Ronsard's work was to tell the history of France from its founding by Francus, a survivor from the Trojan War and a son of Hector, to the present day. Delayed by Henry II's death in 1559 due to a jousting accident, and it's an example of why treating Sparta was a dumb thing, considering that Henry II died with a splinter to the eye, something to bear in mind. Ronsard continued work on the epic during the reign of Henry's son, Charles IX. More than just a history, the Francide presented Charles as a contemporary incarnation of the founder of the French nation, as Hector's child, being the stock of French kings. The Francide belonged to a tradition of a permeable idea of medieval historiography, which included everything from chronicles to hagiographies and what we now consider to be historical fiction, such as the Chants de Geste, the Chants de Roman, which we've spoken, I think, a lot today, which makes me happy that I realize I'm on the same wavelength with a lot of people, as well as visual media. History served a didactic function. It also reflected medieval interest in explaining the origins of nations, sometimes creatively, as chroniclers grafted contemporary royal families onto genealogical trees showing descent from illustrious biblical patriarchs such as Adam or Noah, drawing conscious comparisons with Jesus' own genealogical narratives found in the Gospels of St. Luke and St. Matthew. Accuracy was very much a secondary concern. The Francide also drew very heavily on the monumental Grand Chronique de France, undertaken during the reign of Louis IX in 1250. It was presented to his son, Philip III, in 1274. It was during this period that the Capetian monarchy was in firm control of France, and a founding narrative was needed to match the prestige of the Capetian kings. Compiled from earlier histories such as the Roman de Troyes, which first appeared in the 1160s, in the Liber Historiae Francorum, the Grand Chronique de France provided such a narrative, emphasizing the Trojan origins of the Capetian monarchy. Trojan founding myths dominated the narratives European monarchs told themselves. Brutus, for example, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kingdom of Britain, was founder of that island nation. By drawing on the Liber Historiae Francorum and the Roman de Troyes, along with the lavish illustrations whose function were more narrative than decorative, the Grand Chronique de France, where it was integral to the project statecraft that lay at the heart of Capetian authority. The same concern informed Francide. planned to do a monument of 26 books. Ronsard only got as far as doing Children, which were 4 books. In the 1573 edition of the 4 books of the French, it runs into already to over 200 pages. So one can imagine what 26 books would have looked like. A hernia-inducing volume, no doubt. But Ronsard went beyond drawing parallels between the Valois monarchy and supposed Trojan origins. The dedicatory verse that introduces the epic reads as follows: Ronsard, you have not composed this work. It was forged by a royal hand. Wise, virtuous Charles, meaning Charles IX, was the author. You are only a scribbler. And how many times have I seen that in my own essays? And so it sort of, I felt for Ronsard. But in this case, the word author conveys a double meaning. Ronsard symbolically ascribes the authorship to Charles, at the same time as interposing the king into the text. Charles' authorship is not just an act of writing, it is an act of birth. Charles is presented as both author and father of France, just as Francus had founded France all those centuries ago. Furthermore, an image of Charles IX is positioned above the verse, so the French verse is there. I've had an English translation, so there's the portrait of Charles IX. That verse in which Ronsard claims that Charles actually is the author of this by sort of supporting the project, emphasizes the connection to France's Trojan origins by linking both the image and voice of the king in print form. The Franciate was not Ronsard's only contribution to the imaging of the monarchy. He was also involved in the preparations for Charles IX's entry to Paris in 1571 to celebrate his marriage to Elizabeth of Austria that had taken place in 1570. In the royal entry set pieces, we see how material and visual media function as historical text, which the targeted audience for this performance of royal authority would read and internalize. Constructed at the Porte Saint-Denis, which is just north of Les Halles, the first entry arch was reserved for Charles. And I apologize for some of the quality of the images. This is an artistic drawing of what the arch would have looked like for the king to come in. On the left is a figure of Francus. And on the right is a figure of Pharamond, who was considered the first king of the French. While the artistic representations show space between the figures, so there's these empty spaces, we know these spaces would have been filled with text. When it was built at the time for the entry, those spaces would have actually had text, which through the miracles of technology, I filled in, considering a new Ronsard, right? So there we go. In French, and again, there's the instructions, the plans for these arches still survive. In fact, have been published in the 1970s. So we know what would have been in those spaces. So the first one would read essentially, "From this great Francus, true stem of the French, and from comes from times past Pharamond, the first of our kings, who took from the Trojans and Germans his birth, whose race today is renewed in France." In the space under Francus, so that's the central portion, under Francus, we have this in Latin. Francus, as the story tells, coming from Ilion's fall, exchanged Nanthus and Simois for Rhine and Danube. He was the first to lead the Franks in the German regions. And under Pharamond was the following. When the Franks grew great, King Pharamond endowed them with laws to make an empire in Gaul. And these two nations, with which Charles did first unite, thou too, O Charles, art now even uniting. The echoes between this and the Franciate, of course, are striking. For the Queen, after all, this was an entry to celebrate a marriage, the Queen also got an arch. And her arch, however, on the left is an image of Pepin, and on the right, an image of Charlemagne. Under her central space was the following. Of religion, Pepin was defender, supported by the Holy Fathers and his son Charlemagne, placing the majesty of the empire and grandeur, holding in his hand the scepter of France and Germany. Under Pepin, in Latin, in times past when it upheld the sacred column, France gained renown. And under Charlemagne, and when I too upheld the broken column of the empire stood fast. and it does so still under my progeny. Among the complex messages, and I think this arch alone could generate papers, but among the complex messages projected by these arches was the emphasis of Charles as the rightful heir, if not the reincarnation of the founders of the French state. The timing of this message could not be more important. And for myself, this is what I find most interesting. Because by 1571, the religious wars had raged for nearly a decade, tearing apart the social and religious fabric of the kingdom and threatening the prestige of the crown itself. Works of the Franciate and set pieces of the royal entries drew upon medieval histories to remind their audiences of the mythical origins of the nation, and more important, remind everyone that through the direct connection to the past, Charles IX was the legitimate ruler of France. So whereas the Franciate projected an image of Charles as the new Francus, as the true descendant, true heir of Charlemagne's empire, by the 1570s, the monarchy had begun to lose control of its ability to manage its image. Writers such as Francois Hauptmann employed history to present a counter-narrative of a tyrannical monarchy that has since Louis XI suppressed the inborn liberties of all Frenchmen. Published in 1573, the Franco-Gallia reflects the new trends in the practice of history taking place in the 16th century. Based on the new educational program Humanism, introduced into France by Francois I, scholars began to emphasize the primacy of ad fontes, or the going back to the sources. This gained further credence as new Greco-Roman sources became more available through translation into vernacular. Jean Baudin's 1566 method for the easy comprehension of history, which again is 300 pages in the modern edition, so one questions how what easy means in this case, is a clear indication of the extent to which the humanist methodology had influenced French historical scholarship. Incorporating elements of what we would now recognize as anthropology and archaeology, Baudin laid out what he considered to be the proper method to study the past. This new methodology is summed up quite nicely in Jean Thier's Recul de France of 1580, in which he says, nations, in order to exalt themselves, invented false origins, which their descendants believed and published. Following Baudin's historical model, the Franco-Gallia rejected Trojan origin myths. Instead, the origins of the French nation were to be found in the Germanic migrations of the 5th and 6th centuries. As with the case of medieval histories, Hauptmann reinvented an idealized past to shape the image of the 16th century monarchy. The Franco-Gallia was a reaction to the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre of 1572, and sits squarely in the tradition of Protestant resistance theory known as monarchism. While the Franco-Gallia itself lacks the incendiary rhetoric of its co-religionists, favoring rather a more academic argument based on his reading of legal history to demonstrate how the crown had lost its legitimacy. For Hauptmann, the solution for France's ills was to be found in the ancient constitution of the Germanic tribes who had lived in a free commonwealth. Hauptmann rejected many of the medieval sources which were instrumental in the royal performance of authority. I quote, "For as to what a certain foolish and ignorant monk called John Turpin has written in his romance of Charlemagne, is stuffed full of old wives' tale and mere impertinencies." Rather, Hauptmann employed those histories that emphasized France's German origins, in particular Gregory Tours. Hauptmann used Gregory Tours actually quite a lot, quite extensively. His reading of these sources revealed a France governed by a precursor of the States General, with a council as a legislative authority designed to constrain the arbitrary power of the king. For Hauptmann, the rule of the early Merovingians best demonstrated how France lived in a state of freedom. For example, the kings were not hereditary, but rather elected and chosen by the council. And because the kings were chosen by these early estates, kings could be deposed if they proved to be bad rulers, as was the case of Chilperic, whose debauchery made him unfit for the throne and was duly deposed and exiled. By going back to these early examples, Hauptmann made the case that 16th century Frenchmen need to reclaim their ancient rights and restore the power of the States General to constrain the power of the king, with the conclusion that the king continued to act in an arbitrary manner, then just as Chilperic, Charles IX was to be deposed. The loss of France's liberties, according to Hauptmann, had begun under the reign of Louis XI. His victory at the conclusion of the War of the Public Weal of 1465 had come at the expense of an independent States General, which had developed out of the ancient Frankish councils. The religious wars exposed the abuses France suffered by allowing the monarchy to claim hereditary and arbitrary authority. Hauptmann's historical researches into the origin of the French state resulted in an integral contribution to the theory of resistance arising out of Protestant writings in the 1570s. And yet, and I think this is a bit of a truism, Hauptmann's own work relies heavily on his own historical inventions and etymological fantasies. Rejecting the notion that the word for Frank derived from Francus, Hauptmann argued that the term was in fact given to the Germanic tribes to mean free or free people due to their constitutions and councils. This was as much a fiction as a Trojan narrative, and many of his contemporaries attacked his work for it. The States General itself was not the timeless guardian of the ancient German consultative bodies, as mentioned by Hauptmann, but rather a more recent development in France's political history. But the invention was important in presenting the case for curbing the authority of the monarch. The works of Ronsard and Hauptmann demonstrate the instability of the image of royal authority in Valois, France. In the project of constructing the Valois monarchy, how writers interpreted France's past was instrumental in the project, and despite the Crown's own efforts, it was largely at the mercy of its own apparatus of image making. And this is one last image, which I think speaks to this hardness. This is from the Archaeological Museum of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just east of Paris. It is, of course, a 19th century version of our ancestors, the Gauls. And of course, it looks very much like Gauls, got a big bushy mustache and the pigtails. What's interesting about this is, of course, this is a 19th century invention of what the Gauls are supposed to look like. And the 19th century was a big fan of trying to find these ancient origins to the authenticity of the French nation, largely as a counter to German hegemony and German challenges. But what's very interesting about this Gaul, which has come to dominate the image of what Gauls are supposed to look like today, is his face. And despite the fact of his very noble, visage, his mustache, manly hair, his Movember, bushy thing as to celebrate, is that the eyes and the facial structure is not of an ancient Gaul. It is not even of an ancient Frank. It is of Napoleon III. So our ancestors, the Gauls, are Napoleonic. Thank you.